There's my assembled and spiked shell. Has the first spiking on there, 12 verticals. That does not have to be dried before the next step of applying the dry wrap is taken. I want to make that dry wrap so it laps to the center of the spillet, comes down, laps almost all the way across the bottom, which is 9.5 inches. And it takes about 12 inches to go completely around one turn of the shell. I want 4 turns, so I want at least 48 inches. So I have torn 3 sheets of my 40-pound paper. It's 18 inches long. Those 3 sheets will go a little more than 4 turns around the shell, and it's 9.5 inches wide. Each sheet is 9.5 inches wide. So I will start putting that paper on the shell, lapping in the correct place on the shell where it laps halfway across the top of the shell and almost all the way across the bottom. I'll start that by applying just a little bit of glue right where it laps onto the shell. And I want to wrap this up very tightly with the edges continually aligned with each other so it's going straight onto the shell. And I will just repeat that with all 3 of those sheets. It should be tight enough where I can see the spiking through the dry wrap paper. I don't know why they don't make Elmer's glue bottles round so they quit tipping over on me. Every time I set that oval bottle down, it tips over on me. I suppose I could find a round bottle somewhere to put that into. Some of these steps are not specifically spelled out in Fulcanelli, so it's really a matter of getting a little bit of a feel for the process and developing some personal techniques using the materials that we have on hand specifically. But there are then a total of 4 turns plus just a couple inches of that paper. Really nice and tight on the shell where I can see the spiking right through the dry wrap paper. This is the bottom of the shell. I have the shell on a stand, a piece of 3-inch PVC. Fulcanelli now says to fold this down in the tongue fold fashion. That can either be done all the folds at once, or he says some builders prefer to do it 1 turn at a time to increase the fireproofness. I do like to do it 1 turn at a time. So I'm going to take and fold that turn in, pleating it down all the way across itself like that. I figure the more folds, the more laps I have in there, the paper onto itself, the more fireproof that's going to be. The more twists and turns the fire would have to go through in order to get into the bottom of the shell. So there's one of those pieces of paper folded in. And I'll just repeat that. I'm not taking small pleats, I'm taking big pleats like would be done with the tongue fold method. But I am doing it with the individual turns of paper. This is one of those processes that one has to sort of develop a personal feel for and a personal technique for, given the options that Fulcanelli spells out, there's 2 turns of the paper folded down. Now I'm on the last, actually 2 sheets of the paper turned down. Now I'm on the last sheet of paper. Taking those big pleats on across. And now that last, as shown in Fulcanelli, that last fold, that last tongue is folded over on itself like this, and then folded inward to create as nice and fireproof a bottom as possible. Now the top, the inner fold, can be folded in 1 turn at a time too, but in this particular case at the top I prefer to do it not 1 turn at a time. The idea is to tear that paper a little bit right where it goes around the spolette. But first, before I do that, before I start laying that paper down, I'm going to put some extra glue. Fulcanelli specs white glue, hide glue, he even says wax can be applied around the spolette. Something to fireproof that as much as possible. Once that is done, the paper is pleated in, laying in pleats where the side of the pleat comes right along the side of the spolette, like so. Now that's ready for the second spiking, which will be identical to the first, except the verticals will lay in between the verticals on the first spiking, and it'll also lay between the horizontals as it's spiraled up the shell. I'm going to mark between each of the first spiking verticals in order to keep this spiking pattern going correctly. I'll create another 12 vertical spiking pattern with the strands halfway between the spiking that was applied first. That keeps the circumference from building up any larger than necessary, and it also distributes the containment on the shell, the strength of the shell that the spiking contributes, keeps that distributed evenly between the 2 applications of spiking, distributed about 1/2 inch on center. I just roughly mark halfway between these horizontals too. Just to sort of keep them distributed evenly too. Now I'll go ahead and put 20 passes, like I did for the first time, of the spiking string on my spiking horse. I really like how the Elmer's glue strengthens, fireproofs, and really glues the spiking string to the shell. I'll put a nice fat bead of glue around the spillet for that first clove hitch of the spiking to really embed down into. Once again, Fulcanelli emphasizes over and over the importance of this seal right around the spillet, using glue, string, tight fitting paper to really make that as gas proof as possible. And now I'll just apply that spiking in the usual off-center spiking pattern. This really pulls that dry wrap down and in around the shell. The nice thing about this is that even though this is a 4-inch shell and might not ordinarily be done with the Rinfasciature method, this can be done out in the field somewhere at a club shoot or something, and constructed this way and taken immediately to the mortar without having to wait for any paste wrap or anything to dry. Taken immediately to the mortar, put up in the air, fired, see how it's performing, see how the stars are performing. Don't have to wait for any drying time. Sometimes that's not convenient out in the field. So there's a complete 12 verticals on the top, complete 12 verticals on the bottom. I'll bring that around, cinch it in next to one of the verticals, spiral down, and begin that horizontal spiking with the horizontals also in between the horizontals of the first spiking pattern, which I can see right here. So I'm going to stay right in between those as it goes up. That first spiking, as the paper gets pulled down, as the paper gets pulled down around that shell, that first spiking pattern really telegraphs through the paper, and I can see exactly where it is. So I can apply this spiking right in between the spiking that was applied the first time around, keeping the containment nice and even all the way around the shell. Once again, I don't have to wait for this to dry, this spiking, even though it is heavily pasted string. I can go ahead and proceed right to the next step, which is applying a thin wrap to flame-proof the spiking and further flame-proof the shell. That's only spiked on with 4 or 6 verticals. Once again, as I'm finishing up this spiking application, I'm going to pay very special attention to the seal around the spillet. Shoving that down with a piece of pipe tightly against that paste wrap, and then even applying a little more glue in that area. And that's now ready for the next application of finish wrap. A final dry wrap to flame-proof the spiking, protect it from the lid gases and everything, is now going to be applied. 2 turns of 30-pound paper. I've got this butcher paper, white butcher paper, which is 30 pound. It will be gathered around the splet, the neck of the splet, and tied with glued string around the neck of the splet, and it will be folded on the bottom, tongue fold, like was done with this dry wrap. That shows me that I need to be about 10 inches wide for that paper. 2 turns would be 24 inches. So I've got a piece of paper 10 inches by 24 here, 30-pound paper. That will be applied in the same way, lapping almost all the way across the bottom of the shell and up against the neck of the splet. So I will put that on there spaced like that, a little bit of glue to hold it to the shell. Once again, putting it on nice and tight and keeping the edges aligned real nicely. This will be held on. Fulcanelli specs 4 to 6 verticals only of spiking. I kind of like to put 8 on. It's easier for me to keep 8 nice and even. So I'm going to put 8 verticals once I have the top and bottom folded and tied the way he specs it. Bottom will be folded down same way as before. Tongue fold. Keeping as much fire from the bottom of that shell as possible. As Fulcanelli says in there, this method, when done on a 3 or 4 inch single break shell, doesn't save much time. It's probably a little more time than just pasting some paper and putting on it. The advantage is the shell can be taken right out and fired. And if it's done on a larger shell, all the paper can be applied at once. There's no waiting for the pasted paper to dry. So there's a nice tongue folded bottom. And then the top is just brought in and tied real tight with some tarred, waxed, or glued paper. I like to use wax string, which is, I've got some waxed linen string, which is very, very strong. Put some glue, more glue around the neck of that split before I tie that paper tightly around it. The more glue, the more seal around that split, the better. Now I'm ready to tie that nice and tight. I've got that glue squishing up out of the up from between the paper and the split, which shows me there's plenty of glue seal around the split there. And I've still got a 1/2 inch of split to tie my fusing to when I lift and leader the shell. I'm going to put one more tie around the neck of that paper to really glue it, adhere it, glue it, seal it tightly against the split. There can't be too much seal here. Now I'm ready to spike the shell. I'm not going to be trying to keep that spiking aligned in any particular way with the spiking that was put on before. So I'll just put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 verticals. Those 8 verticals will only use a little less, about 6 to 7 feet of the spiking twine, so I've only put that much plus a little bit on my spiking horse. And this spiking is only designed to keep this paper on here, so the glued, nicely pasted string does really help the spiking bite into the paper, stay where I put it, and once it's drying it will stick to the shell very nicely. And there's a finished pattern on the bottom, tic-tac-toe pattern, 8 verticals, 1 coming around, finishing off the pattern on the top. Now I'm just going to wind this string around this spoolet some to further seal that seal between the paper and the spoolet, and I'll finish that off with a couple half hitches. There we go. Why am I having so much trouble figuring out which way to put that on? I don't know. So there, I've got a nice reinforced neck around the spoolet. And that's ready to install a lift wrap and lift charge to. At this point, Fulcanelli says lift and leader the shell as you normally would. Well, the way I would normally lift and leader is to apply a pasted outer wrap, lift wrap, let that dry. That's not going to work well with this shell since I'm not pasting anything. So I'm going to install the pacifier as I normally would. And then I'm going to apply the dry wrap that is specified in Fulcanelli 1 as an option for finishing a shell. It's a dry wrap tied at the neck around the spoolet, and then sort of with that bun created at the bottom of the shell to enclose the lift charge. Bottom line is I won't be applying that New Jersey bottom patch finish on this shell. I'll be applying that variation of a dry wrap with the bun at the bottom of the shell. Did I scratch that? Nope. Scraped it, but I didn't scratch it. So there's a scraped and scratched spoolet powder core grain. There's the pacifier tied around the spolet in the usual way. I'll put a bucket around that. Put a bucket around the top of the shell, and I'm ready to put my lift wrap around there. Because the paper tied around the spolet and the pasted string around there, I needed to make a slightly larger bucket than my normal 3/4 inch ID one. So this one's rolled up on a 1-inch Star Comet pump piston. Now, since my lift wrap will be also gathered up around the neck of the spolet like a paper bag and come down, and will create enough of a lift bag to create the bun, contain the lift charge, and then gather in and tie like a paper sack in the bottom. I think I'm going to make that about 14 inches wide. That'll be 2 wraps of the 40-pound paper again. I'll install that lift wrap with enough to come up and gather in around the spolet like a paper bag. Put a little glue on that. Wrap that up nice and tightly, keeping the edges aligned. It's being stubborn as far as keeping the edges aligned. There we go. The tighter this is around the shell, the better it'll be at preventing the lift charge from migrating up alongside the shell. But there's also that bun creation trick, which will prevent that from happening too. I'll gather this in around the top of the shell, tie that off. That will just receive a leader then, like any standard shell would, going into the bucket up there. The fun trick for the bottom of the shell is the creation of that bucket, or that bun, by putting a clove hitch around that lift wrap right at the bottom of the shell, and then just cinching that in just a little bit so it pulls that lift wrap in, oh, a 1/4 inch or so, all the way around the shell. Once that's full of lift powder, that bun will be created, and this slight cinching around the bottom of the shell like that prevents that lift charge from migrating up alongside the sides of the shell. It'll stay down below the shell. Now I have 2 ounces that are on the lift charge for a 4-inch single break shell. I just pour that into the bottom of the lift wrap and just gather the lift wrap up around that lift charge like so, sort of pushing down the sides to create that bun so that string tie around the perimeter can't fall off. Cinch that off with a clove hitch, and the shell's ready for a leader, and take it out and fire it. There's that bun, it's cinched in so the powder can't migrate up along the sides of the shell. And that's ready for a leader and firing. Put a little glue alongside the leader. Got plenty of black match bare on that. That's going right down to the top of the split. Put that in there and tie that off well. Be interested to see how these daytime smoke stars perform coming out of this Rinfasciature 4-inch single break. I've made some brilliant color star shells using this Rinfasciature method, and I really am impressed with the way these shells break. They break every bit as nicely as a standard pasted shell, if not a little more nicely. I think they're a little more contained. So that baby's ready to take out and fire. Certainly a never bad idea after making a shell like this, starting with a standard size case former, to check the fit in the gun, make sure it's going to slide down into the intended mortar just fine. That's still got plenty of room around it, so that did not come anywhere near to getting too large for the mortar.